You all are here. I'm excited about this forum. I'm going to introduce these two lovely women and then basically sort of listen myself. When Mary Clow began to talk to me about the possibility of doing this, I didn't know that there was a Tyndale Society, and I didn't know of the Moore Society either, but they seem to like each other a lot, which is good because they're going to be talking about two men who very much did not like each other. I'm very delighted to have them, and I'm going to let them tell you really who they are. Mary Clow is we sort of like claim to her. She lives here and in London and comes back and forth, and so if you're thinking you've seen her, you have. She's here part of the year, and we claim her as ours. Mary Claire Phelippeau is, where do you live?
I live in France.
That's what I thought. She speaks French. She lives in France. It's wonderful. It's a great deal for her. We're delighted to have her. She's going to speak on the other side, talking about Thomas More. They've got some great things planned. So, Mary Claire, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you just go forward. And I'll let you know when it's time to start.
Thank you, Buddy. Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Well, I run the Tyndale Society, which Buddy hadn't heard of, which is a worldwide society of about 300 members, many of them in the United States, and we hold conferences and lectures and events, and we, in general, look into the story of Tyndale, the people associated with him, why he's relevant today. The most relevant thing about William Tyndale is this little book. This book changed our world. It was published in 1526. It became a banned book almost instantly. It was burned by the authorities. It is the New Testament. And it's the New Testament translated into English from the original languages for the first time. That's really important. So it was translated from Greek, which was the language in which we have the New Testament. But Tyndale then learned Hebrew, and he then understood that often under the Greek would be the Hebrew, which is related to Aramaic. And this is the basis of all English language Bibles today. The so-called King James Version is 80% William Tyndale. He is the forgotten man. He was plagiarized more than any writer, you could say, in the history of the world. But what he did was that English was then a minority language spoken only by about 3 million people, of whom a very tiny number could read. And it was a despised language. Her gentleman, Thomas More, said that it was too crude a tongue for Holy Scripture. And that was quite widely believed. There was no literature in English. At that time, there had been Chaucer, 150 years before, in Middle English, but there was no prose written in English. English was not used as a writer's language. And we have a saying, no Tyndale, no Shakespeare. And that is pretty much agreed by scholars. Anyway, that's William Tyndale, the linguist. But why did he translate this book? Why was it forbidden? Well, it was forbidden by the church in any language except Latin. And the Latin, of course, was a translation from the original Greek into Latin, which was the common language when it was translated by Jerome. It's known as the Vulgate, that version of Latin. And that version was used for 1,000 years throughout Western Europe. It was the only authorized version. And it had become very corrupt. Often there was better knowledge of Latin and better understanding than Jerome had had, for example. But that version was the only version permitted to be used. To the extent that people were burned for teaching their children the Lord's Prayer in English. This is really a strong thing to understand. William Tyndale grew up in the countryside in England. He lived in rural circumstances. We know very little about, we don't even know the names of his parents. But we know that he went to Oxford and he became a priest. He was obviously very, very intelligent. He was brilliant at languages from the beginning. He learned many languages. And he developed a passion that the simple people could understand the language of their faith. I think it truly was a passion. It's the passion that drove him throughout his life. He did a trial translation of a passage of Greek which was not holy work, and presented it to the Bishop of London and asked permission just to show how good he was at Greek, if he could go ahead and try the New Testament. And the bishop said, no, we're not ready for that. We're not interested. And more or less sent him packing. And he realized quite quickly that he would be had up for heresy if he persisted. So he got himself to the continent where there were brilliant printers. He may have stayed a bit in Württemberg with Martin Luther. We don't know that. That's a myth, but maybe true. We don't know. It's never referred to. And he translated this. And the first version was, the printing was interrupted by the authorities who shut it down as a work of heresy, forbidden. He got himself to Antwerp, which was a safe city with wonderful printers, and that's where he lived to the end of his life. He then learned Hebrew, he translated the Pentateuch, he translated the book of Jonah, he mapped out some further work, but tragically, before he could finish, he was kidnapped, is the only thing you can say. There was a price on his head. He was a banned man, he was a heretic. He was kidnapped, he was imprisoned for 1.5 years. He was tried before the scholars of the day. Very complicated trial, we wish we had the transcript of it. And he was taken out and strangled and burned as a heretic. That was in 1536. So that's the outline of his life. Of course, his work survived and was smuggled into England. People read it, people were excited by it. People were absolutely ignited by the idea of the scripture that they could understand, they could enter into, and that they could engage with the scripture without somebody in between, without an interpreter, without a priest, without being given little snippets of it. Of course, people had known the Bible, they'd known the Bible stories, but they'd been handed on to them through another agency. It was always said that the cathedrals were the Bibles of the poor, because the cathedrals, the great cathedrals, would have had in stained glass and frescoes and paintings and imagery, all the stories of the Bible, very dramatically, wonderful. That's what we call religious art. It's wonderful, we love it. It's not the same as taking this little book and reading it to yourself, or reading it in little groups, which is what happened. Women used to read it among themselves, perhaps with their maidservants and their friends. They'd read it with their children. It was read in families. It was read very intensely in the home. It's a quite different form of reading than having something told you in a big cathedral. And that, of course, is the basis of the Reformation. And you might then say all the subsequent troubles that have flowed from that, which I would not deny happened. I would not deny that this little book brought a lot of suffering to a lot of people and obliterated a lot of wonderful features of Catholicism which then existed. But that is the story of William Tyndale. And I think my friend here would tell you what happened with Thomas More.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, thank you. And then Marie-Claire Phelippeau, who was a professor of English literature in France. I've come here.
Claire, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. Let me just get this a little bit closer to me. Just speak loud.
All right. That'll be better. I'll do my acting now. So, I've come here to London, I've come here to New York, sorry, invited by Mary, and thank you very much. And we are both talking about Renaissance topics. Me, Thomas More, Mary, William Tyndale, of course, and the two enemies are reunited through us, I hope, today. So let me tell you who Thomas More was. He was a Londoner who lived at the beginning of the 16th century, the 1500s. And he was born in London, stayed in London all his life, didn't have to emigrate or exile, suffer exile as William Tyndale has. And he was very much, he was a writer of the book Utopia. He invented the word utopia, meaning no place, in Latin. So not yet in English, as Mary told you, that English was not so far the language of literature. He also wrote in English, but what he wrote in English was not published at that time. Later, yes, that's another story. Then Thomas More went also to Oxford, learned Greek, also learned Greek, and came back to London because his father didn't want him to be a literary man as he wanted to be. So he happened to write, but that was not his job. So his father said, "My son, you're going to be a lawyer like I am." And little Thomas said, yes, father, because obedience was a great virtue and he could not consider going against his father. So he became a lawyer. But he also would have liked to become a monk. Well, he hesitated, so he went to the Charter House, stayed a few years there, and decided that he needed a woman, and so he would not be a good priest or a good monk, and he said, "I would prefer to be a good father and a good husband rather than a bad priest." So he chose, so Erasmus says, we are not totally sure about this, but it sounds really possible. And so he chose to marry, and then he was a good lawyer. The poor loved him when he judged, and he tried to be very kind with the poor. And I know that he was really surrounded by many people who wanted to give him their pleas and so forth. Then Henry VIII took him as his counselor. So he had many offices, many different offices, like under sheriff of London, then sheriff of Lancaster, and so forth. Until 1529, when Henry VIII, his king, asked him to be his chancellor. So he became chancellor after Cardinal Wolsey, who you may have heard of, and who was in disgrace at that time. So Thomas More took over, not being a priest, not being a cardinal, not being a cleric, served him to have this position. But Thomas More didn't accepted that office with great reluctance. He knew that it was going to be dangerous because at the same time Henry VIII wanted to divorce his queen, Catherine of Aragon, because she hadn't been able to, she hadn't given him an heir. No, the boy that she'd had died, and so Henry wanted to, of course, have a boy, have a son. Then he was in love with the other woman, Anne Boleyn, and so asked the Pope to cancel his marriage so that he could marry Anne Boleyn again instead. The Pope never admitted, never cancelled his marriage. But Henry was so cross that he said, "Okay, I will not hear the Pope." I make it simple, of course. If we go into details, it's just a little more complicated than this. But anyway, he disobeyed the Pope and said, "I'm the head of the church now. I don't care about the Pope." And the Pope was not always very widely respected, as you'd had popes that did not behave as popes so much as warriors and so forth. And so even Erasmus had gone to Italy, to Rome, and had come back saying, well, the court in the Vatican is really dissolute. And so anyway, Henry had plenty of good reasons to say, we do away with the Pope. Now, Thomas More was a very strong Catholic, believed in the church, and thought the church was highly important because the Holy Spirit would inspire what the church decided. So he thought that this was the voice of God, not only the Bible, and that people were not able to read the Bible by themselves. They needed the church to enlighten them about the Word of God. And he thought that reading the Bible by yourself and deducing what was right and what was wrong and what God expected from you was just sheer pride. So Thomas More accused William Tyndale of pride and of dissent and of breaking up the church into bits, and so that the unity of the church, which was what counted for Thomas More, was not happening. So he became very fierce and fought against the heretics. And as he was chancellor, during his chancellorship, he had the authority. He could sign himself the order to transfer these heretics to prison and then to the stake, and they would get burned. And he did it. And he was responsible himself, although many Catholics have long denied this because they wouldn't believe the historical accounts of John Fox. But now I think everybody agrees reasonably that Thomas More was responsible for the death at the stake of 6 heretics, and we know the names. When I'm being asked about this, I give the names to poor Catholic monks who never knew that this had happened to their patron saint, for example. So it's rather distressing for us, of course. But then we try to understand why he did it, because in his utopia he had preached religious toleration. People could believe what they wanted as long as they did not create disorder in the city. So that was fine. Everybody thought, oh, what a new idea, how brilliant. But then he did not apply it when his time came to really put it into practice. Because he was ordered by his bishop, he was ordered by other people, by his king first. Henry VIII agreed with that very much. He was a good Catholic until he broke with the Pope. Then he also thought he was a good Catholic without the Pope, but never a reformer. Henry VIII never considered himself a reformer. And so Thomas More, in fact, was then responsible for this death. And we try to understand this through the fact that he believed that pride was really the ultimate evil that you should try to eradicate in society. And if people thought of themselves more than of the public good, that was wrong. So that's how I would emphasize in Thomas More these qualities, that always trying to protect the public good. Whenever you put an action, don't think of yourself first. Think of the public good first, of society or the others, and then see how you can act. And sometimes you just don't know what's right and what's wrong. And so when, after being a chancellor, doing all these things, and then having to sign that, okay, Henry VIII, you're going to divorce from your queen, and okay, you're going to place a new queen instead, and your first queen will be just called lady and not queen, and then your first daughter will not be called princess, but Lady Mary, etc. He could not agree, and so he dismissed, he resigned. He resigned from office, giving up the seal, the royal seal, back to his king, and saying, somebody else, I cannot do that. And so, they tried to convince him very much, for a long time, and he was interrogated back home, back in the tower, in Lambeth Palace, etc. He went here and forth, and they gave him all sorts of arguments so that he should sign. Oh, you know, there are much better people than you who have signed. These monks have signed, these bishops have signed. Why don't you sign? It's just, you said that pride is wrong, but you are being very proud. And he said, well, just my conscience, my God, my conscience cannot allow me to do this. So he perhaps was the first one, I think he was, to write about conscience, to say that your conscience is your guide. Look into yourself, think, just go back within yourself and meditate and ask God for his counsel, and you will understand there is something within you that tells you what's right and what's wrong. I just cannot resolve myself to signing something which I think is really wrong and will lead me to evil. And he said, I can't pin up my soul on the back of somebody else that will lead me to hell. So that's it. That's the things I think that I can remember myself now, is trying to think of public good every time that you act, and you think of Thomas More's model, and then use your conscience to know what's right and what's wrong. That's it.
Very interesting, both of your comments. So I get that. I think it's fascinating. Why do you all care so much about it? Mary, why don't you try that?
Well, I'll tell you, we have a long-running feature in our little journal we put out, and it's called How I Met William Tyndale. And it's amazing how people relate, how they first heard of William Tyndale. Because I must confess, when I first heard of the Society, I thought, William Tyndale translated the Bible, I think, but I don't know what happened to him. And I think most people react like that. And what caught me about William Tyndale was reading his translations. I'll tell you the passage that caught me was in the story of the Garden of Eden. And when the serpent tempts Eve, and she said, of that tree we shall not eat. And the serpent, this is a speaking snake, if you remember. He's not the devil in the Bible. He's often depicted as the devil. He isn't Satan in the Bible. He's a snake with dogs. And he says to Eve, tush, tush, ye shall not die. Well, when I read that tush, I just went, yes. You know, it's tush. It's like what you might say to a child or some silly person, tush. It's making an idiot of her. It's joking with her. It's teasing her. It was just so brilliant. Of course, it's gone from the King James. It was too kind of country speak, you know, too kind of familial for the King James. And the King James Bible, don't forget, was a production of scholars and academics. They were nearly all academics or churchmen, professionals. It's a really important point. Tyndale, of course, was trained as a priest and was educated at Oxford, but he was translating for the common man, for the ordinary person, so the Bible would speak to them as it had spoken originally. He has a big passage where he says, people originally read the Bible in their mother tongue. They read it in their mother tongue when their mother tongue was Latin. Why should they not now have it in their mother tongue? Which is a very big point. And another thing was he was close to the people, so he used terms which they would understand. I mean, again, Jesus is in the boat, and he falls asleep. If you remember, it's in a storm. And the disciples wake him up and say, do you want us all to drown? And in the King James, Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat. Now, if you've ever been on anyone's boat and you throw it at the front and the back, you quite quickly get ticked off. I'm sure you've had that experience. It's the bow and the stern. I mean, anyone who's been on a boat finds that out very quickly. Well, Tyndale had him asleep in the stern of the boat, because he knew what you called a boat. The academics had never been on a boat, you know, they were in Oxford. It's just an example. So that's really what grabbed me about William Tyndale. And then what touched me was his persistence. A lot of his friends were taken and burned by this gentleman here. He knew his life was in danger. There was a sum of money on his head. He knew he was in hiding. He often, you know, his printer used a fake name because he didn't want to be identified as the man who printed this little book. I mean, it was a dangerous life. And I think his sweetness speaks through to me, his sweetness in the words he chose in his translations, but also in his life. When he was in prison for over a year before he was convicted, and it was a certainty he would be convicted, so he knew what was going to happen and burned. And his jailer's wife took the long journey from the prison to the house where he'd last been sheltered, which was run by English people, English merchants in Antwerp. She travelled from there, which must have been a day's journey on foot, in order to speak to the people who'd sheltered him and tell them how he died. Now, that's an extraordinary fact, and that is a fact. There are many myths about William Tyndale, and we in the Society try to get rid of them. We try to stick with what we know historically, and we try to tell the truth and tell it in a way we can understand. And this biography by David Daniel, who started the Tyndale Society 20 years ago. This is published by Yale University Press. You could buy it on Amazon for, I don't know, a few dollars. And ditto, Tyndale's New Testament, published by Yale University Press, again in paperback. This is in modern spelling, so it's very easy to read. And this is the New Testament. You can also buy the Old Testament, as far as he got, with the tush. But this is a lovely book. I really recommend it. I'm not selling it for any other reason.
Mary Clow, when you hear Mary talk about how Tyndale wanted, really from it sounds like the depth of his soul,
Yes.
to be able to make this accessible to people of all classes, and what can be wrong with that?
Oh no, nothing. On the contrary, I think if Thomas More had been more open, perhaps in those days, he would have found the same. He has given pieces of translation of the Bible also, because he wanted these ideas to project too. But he was very much an academic, in fact. He was a humanist. He looked into Greek, well, like Tyndale, I suppose, but he didn't have the same approach. He was rather more a public man, so he tried to do things at government level. And although he wrote Memento Mori, he wrote a book called The Four Last Things, which he didn't publish and which he didn't finish, and which I translated into French. This was specifically to warn people against sins and dangers and help them to remember death so that they could win heaven. But he was in this was his guideline. And I think he was more than Tyndale, medieval in his way of seeing the church, seeing religious issues. And this did not, perhaps he wasn't modern enough here. Or perhaps, I can't believe that he was jealous that somebody was doing it, whereas he would have done it. Because he could have done it perfectly well, being a writer. And that's how he got involved in so many difficult things, because he wrote so well in Latin and in other languages, and in Latin and English, that people asked him to defend themselves, you know, to be their representative. The merchants wanted him as a representative in Parliament, etc. And he equally defended the poor, as I said, in his judgments, in his trials, because being a chancellor, he was used as a judge in the Star Chamber, etc., and he had many pleas, and he collected them, little papers, and then he looked at them in the night and tried to defend the people, and etc. So he looked at the common people very much. There was another instance too, which is famous for that. Oh yes, when before Henry VIII was in office, it was his father, Henry VII, who tried to impose heavy taxes on the people. And Thomas More, was a young representative in Parliament. And he defended, he opposed the king then, saying that no, you should not, Parliament, you should not accept to sign the taxes that Henry VIII wants to levy on the people. They are not rich enough. Henry VII wanted to levy, that's right. And he got his way. So the tax people did not have to suffer from these taxes. But then he considered exile because the king was extremely cross against him. So he thought he was going to live in France afterwards. But then the king died, so he was saved. And he hoped Henry VIII would be the savior, the redeemer, that he would be a marvelous king, and he wrote a marvelous ode to the coronation, because he thought, we are saved. This guy is going to be much better and listen to us, and etc. But in fact, it ended very badly since Henry VIII, because Thomas More never signed his agreement. Then Henry VIII had his head cut off. So both our friends got, in the end, executed before their times.
And within a few months of each other. It's an incredible parallel story.
Did they literally know each other?
No.
No, they didn't see each other.
They never met.
No, they never met, but there's evidence that they would have known each other by sight. I mean, certainly, Tyndale only lived in London for just over a year. But at that time, London was very tiny, and anybody like More, who had an official position, would have walked through the streets with people saying, clear the way for Sir Thomas More, and you would have seen everybody. It's a very interesting detail, that London being so tight and close, medieval streets. They lived very near each other. Tyndale preached in the church where More's family had worshipped, maybe More not at that time, but certainly his grandfather. It's very extraordinary how closely these two their lives came together.
Yes.
If you all are willing, I'd like to open this to some questions from the floor. So be thinking. I want to ask you one, though, Mary, that I am not really clear on. Did Tyndale think of himself as a reformer? I mean, obviously he was in some sense, but would he have, if he did see Martin Luther, would he have been of the same mind?
Yes.
What did he think?
Yes, he certainly, his theology was certainly of the Reformed school. And he wrote quite a lot of theology in prologues to his translations, and he also wrote 2 or 3 prose works, which again were published and printed. And one of them, which is so interesting, it's the first written prose in English, in modern English, and it's called The Obedience of a Christian Man. And it's rather charmingly, the 50 pages on it are like a good manners guide for Tudor times. I mean, he says, fathers, do not beat your sons because they will come to despise you and you will not make a good child. And husbands, love your wives. Masters, feed your servants, clothe your servants, even educate your servants. I mean, he speaks of how you should behave in society, from the higher to the lower and the lower to the higher. It's a wonderful little passage, only 50 pages, but then after that, I'm afraid it's a huge rant against all the wrongs he saw in the church at his time. And he speaks against the Pope with more scorn and outrage than you could imagine. I mean, some of it's very funny, but it's certainly scurrilous, and I think that's what got him burned, this is what he wrote in the book. Yes.
Are there questions? I expect some of you. Yes, right here in the front. If you'll wait until Versailles gets to you with the mic so we can record your question. I could hum the tune to something. There it is.
Please hurry with the microphone. Thank you. Tyndale, to a large extent, I understand, like Wycliffe was, at the beginning of the modern period, I would call it maybe the democratization of scripture. Today we have free vernacular scriptures in many languages, and I think that's part of just being a modern. So my question to you is, if Tyndale was alive today, and here we are at the verge of another age, let's call it post-modernity, what do you think would be the causes that he would champion?
That's a wonderful question.
Well, he'd certainly like people to read the Bible more. And I think he would like us to be more united in our faith. I mean, he spoke a lot about, for example, he said extraordinary things like, if your neighbor happens to be a Turk, which was the term they used at that time for a Muslim, if your neighbor is a Turk, the love your neighbor applies equally to the Turk who is your neighbor. Quite an astonishing statement. And I think he would like us to not emphasize our differences, but try and find the things which join us together and live within those. I really do think that.
That's a really interesting question. Do you have some ideas what he might be for? Nothing like putting you on the spot, but I wondered if you had something in mind. I usually know what I'm going for when I ask a question. And I'm waiting for them to stop talking so that I can talk. Maybe you're more evolved than I am. But.
No, but I'm thinking inside there that really you have an answer to my question.
Well, next question, please. I think I am interested in the question, and I have no idea, but I mean, so much is happening in the vernacular today, and in our tradition, we didn't even deal real well in the late 70s with getting a new prayer book. And when I say, as I do from time to time, that we're definitely headed for another new one in the next few years, it makes people just cringe. But I believe that Tyndale would be for everything that I'm for, actually. And I like that about him. So, who has another question? Yes, Adelaide in the back. Mursad? Oh, I'm sorry, somebody's already got it.
Scott Orderud,
Yes, Scott.
from Northeast Georgia here in the United States. In what ways, and I guess I'm looking for two answers to one question. In what ways do we see the continuing impact, or perhaps the fingerprints of these two men on church life, both within the Church of England and also the other expressions of Christianity in the British Isles, that is, Methodist, Presbyterian, and so forth? Thoughts on that? The ways in which these two men have had an indelible influence on church life today in the British Isles. Thank you.
Well, yes.
It's hard.
I mean, I think if I just go quickly first, because you asked about England, the multiple faiths, the multiple ways of expressing your faith, where you have the same faith, came from the translation of the Bible. I mean, Thomas More was right in that he saw the disintegration of the universal church, which people were united, even united in the language which they worshipped, although it wasn't the language they understood. That was wiped away by the Bible in the vernacular. And all of, let's say, some of the beliefs that we hear of today, which break your heart because it's such a misreading of what's said in the text. Some of those come from having the Bible in the vernacular and doing just what Tyndale made possible, to read it at home, to think about what it means. Well, I'm not going to define these crazy beliefs, but I'm sure all of us in this room have had instances of it. And you hear something, you think, oh, your life is driven mad by this horrible belief that you have, which you believe comes out of the text, which I read with joy, and you read it with a kind of weird persistence. I mean, that's universal, and that came out of having the Bible in the vernacular. We have to accept. And Thomas More saw that was a danger, and he was right.
Yes, I think Thomas More is helpful to the Catholic Church today as a model, as a martyr. He's a saint, he's been canonized, and he is a part of the great family, the Holy Communion of all saints. And he's seen as a help. We tend to appeal to saints. I remember my father tried to cure people, and he said, oh, it's not me, it's just my friends up there, the saints that help me. And so I prayed to St. Michael for this. I prayed, so maybe he was wrong, but this helped him tremendously. And we feel that we are sort of a channel from here to heaven. And I think Thomas More was very much, this kind helps us find this channel to heaven. He had such a great hope of heaven. He was inhabited by his hope. And that's why when I made a dissertation on Thomas More, in his representation of heaven and hell and purgatory, I might not agree with everything, but this is another problem. But his hope of heaven fascinated me, and I thought that why he made it his life according to his hope. So trying to take all the necessary paths to ensure that he was going to heaven. So I found that tremendous, because that was not easy. That meant renouncing the world and renouncing and going to martyrdom too.
Just the phrase "inhabited by hope" is such a lovely way of putting that.
Okay.
And a wonderful thing to think about.
Yes.
Coming from him. Adelaide, do you have a question? Yes. This will have to be our last one. I'm sorry, we're out of time.
What was William Tyndale's attitude towards the Mass, the celebration of the Mass? Did he go as far as to express an opinion about that, as well as about the reading of the Bible in the vernacular?
That's a very good question. He would only have known the Mass in his experience of worship. And he was once asked by a friend what was his opinion on transubstantiation, which I imagine is what you're referring to, whether the bread and wine become body and blood, in fact, in the Mass. And he said there are some things which are known only to God, which is a wonderful answer. And what he personally believed, I don't know. But I think he generally did not like the concept, which was very, very strong in his time, particularly in the country, that the Mass was a kind of magical event which would protect you simply by being in the church when the wafer was held up, was a kind of magical event. Everyone would fall on their knees and bow down before it and feel that that would protect them from all the dreadful things around them which were going to happen. I think he was very, very against that. He didn't really believe in what was in the Gospels as being what should drive your life and not this magic.
Do you know, Mary, if he, in exile, continued to go to Mass? Or say Mass?
Yes, I think he was in this, the last years of his life were in what was called the English House, which was a house of merchants in Antwerp, which was where they were allowed to have live within their own rules. It was like a little enclave. And he was safe and secure there. And sometimes he's referred to as the chaplain. I don't think it was a formal position, but I think sometimes he probably would have taken services, yes. And certainly had Bible readings and so on. And people there would have been like-minded with him. And so, yes, I think so.
Thank you both so much. This has
Thank
been
you.
really